So as the heart is pumping, there's those heart sounds, okay, the lub-dub. So what occurs is when the atria contract, they fill the ventricles with blood, and then the ventricles contract. When the ventricles contract, the pressure inside the ventricles increases. Think of, squeezing a water bottle that's going to force water out of the water bottle. So when the ventricles contract, the pressure inside, the blood pressure increases. That closes these valves. Okay? There's two valves between the atria and the ventricles. They're called atrioventricular valves. They get slapped shut as the pressure inside the ventricles increases as the ventricles contract. The ventricles continue to contract. As the blood pressure in the ventricles continues to rise, eventually the blood is forced out of these other valves here, which are the valves between the aorta and what's called the pulmonary trunk. Okay, these big blood vessels that are carrying blood out of the heart. So as the ventricles continue to contract, the first valves close, then the blood's ejected out of the second type of valves, which are called semilunar valves. The blood's ejected out, and then the ventricles go into relaxation or diastole. The blood pressure in there drops, the pressure within them drops. That closes these semilunar valves because there's a little bit of backflow and it slaps them shut. So as the ventricles contract, first they close the first set of valves, blood pushes out the second set of valves, and then they close. So you can actually hear those valves closing, and that's the lub-dub sound. Lub-dub. Lub-dub of each heartbeat. It's the closure of the valves within the heart that causes this lub-dub sound. So the function of the valves, again, is to prevent backflow of the blood. As the ventricles contract, the blood just wants to get out of the ventricles, getting pushed out. These valves prevent backflow of blood back into the atria, and because of the structure of these valves, and then the structure of these valves allows blood to get ejected out of the heart, out of the ventricles, and then they'll close to prevent backflow back into the ventricles. So the valves force blood to move in one direction from the atria into the ventricles and then out of the heart. Now sometimes you may have heard of what's called a heart murmur. So a heart murmur is an unusual sound due to valves that are defective and valves that don't close properly and cause a little bit of backflow either into the atria or back into the ventricles, and it causes a distinctive sound that's referred to as a heart murmur because of defective valve or valves in the heart. And depending how serious that is, it can get treated with a number of ways, including surgery and valve replacement. Okay, let's move on to quick review. So diastole, remember that means relaxation of the atria and the ventricles, and that lasts for less than half a second, 0.4 seconds. During that time, the blood's constantly moving. So during that time, the blood flows into the atria and then passively trickles down into the ventricles. Then we get atrial contraction or atrial contraction, atrial systole. The atria contract and that finishes filling the ventricles, and that's 1/10 of a second. That's rapid. There's a slight delay. Then the ventricles contract or ventricular systole occurs. Okay, and that's about 1/3 of a second, that overall time frame. And that ejects the blood out of the heart. So all combined, one cardiac cycle for someone at rest is about 0.8 seconds, just under a second. About half of that time, the heart's in diastole, or at rest. None of the chambers are contracting. When the heart goes into systole, it's sequential. First, the atria contract, atrial systole. There's a slight delay, and then the ventricles contract, or ventricular systole occurs. And then there's that pause as the atria passively fill, and then the next set of contractions of the atria, then the ventricles. So I said that the atria contract first, there's a slight pause, and then the ventricles contract first. That's essential to allow proper filling of the ventricles by having the atria contract first, slight delay, and then the ventricles contract, ejecting the blood out of the heart. So this is a coordinated sequence of events. So who does the coordinating? We have a pacemaker in our heart, and that helps control the heart rate, how fast the heart beats. So the pacemaker, or what's called the SA node, the sinoatrial node, number 1 here, it's a region, a patch of cells. There are specialized heart cells that they don't contract, but what they do is generate a heart impulse, a contraction impulse. It's located in the right atrium, here at number 1. It's called the SA node. It's the pacemaker of the heart. That initiates the sequence of events that lead to the atria to contract, then the ventricles to contract. So it generates electrical impulses, or contraction impulses, the SA node here at number 1, and that spreads rapidly throughout the atria. So then the cells, the cardiac cells of the atria, which can contract upon stimulation, electrical impulse, they get that signal from the SA node, and then they contract. At the same time, that contraction electrical impulse hits this little area, what's called the AV node, and it's paused there for 1/10 of a second. So notice here in my little GIF, the SA node fires, sets off the electrical impulse for contraction. Where's my cursor? Here we go. That signal spreads throughout the atria, they contract. There's a slight delay at the what's called the AV node before that signal reaches the ventricles. So that delay is critical because it allows the atria to contract, fully filling the ventricles. Then the ventricles contract, ejecting the blood out of the heart. So the impulse passes to this little delay point for about 1/10 of a second. That allows the atria to fully empty, filling the ventricles before the electrical contraction signal reaches all of the ventricles. Well, reaches the ventricles and initiates the ventricular contraction, or ventricular systole. Then the impulse causes the ventricles to contract, ventricular systole, ejecting the blood out of the heart. So this pacemaker, number 1, the SA node, sinoatrial node, directs the heart to beat faster or slower depending on demands of the body. Like if you start exercising, the SA node starts depolarizing, starts sending the contraction signal at a faster rate, so that the heart beats faster and is able to deliver blood to the body and make sure that you have an ample supply of oxygen and glucose, nutrients to your cells to be able to handle something like exercise. So the pacemaker can fail and not function properly to generate the appropriate impulses, electrical impulses, to control and initiate the contraction of the atria, then the contraction of the ventricles. All right, so if that occurs, if the pacemaker does not have its electrical impulses coordinated properly and timed properly, the heart can contract out of sync, producing an erratic heart rhythm. The heart can go into erratic arrhythmia, and it can actually fail on the person. So an artificial pacemaker is one possible solution, and it can be implanted, and it has an electrode, a lead that leads into the heart right at the near the SA node or right at the SA node, and the pacemaker takes over, sending the signal, initiating the signal at the SA node to time the appropriate contraction sequence of the atria, then the ventricles. Let's move on to blood vessels. So the heart is the pump in the cardiovascular system, and the blood vessels are the plumbing or the tubes that deliver the blood throughout the body. So arteries are called arteries because they're always carrying blood away from the heart. So A for artery, artery, A for away, all right? So if it's a blood vessel that's carrying blood away from the heart, it's always an artery. That's independent of the oxygen content, okay? Veins are always transporting, carrying blood to the heart. So think of voyage back towards the heart, voyage, veins, all right? And in between are the thinly walled capillaries where the exchange of nutrients and gases is going to occur between the bloodstream and the cells through the interstitial fluid. And as the veins get smaller, they're called arterioles. Arterioles lead into the capillary beds or networks. Exiting the capillary beds are small veins called venules. They merge into veins, into bigger veins, and all the way back to the heart. So the blood vessels are always lined by a thin layer of epithelial cells. It's only one cell layer thick, whether they're capillaries or arteries or veins. The structural differences in the walls of these blood vessels is based on the function of the blood vessels. Arteries are carrying blood at a higher blood pressure because they're closer to the heart, so they're more thickly walled. They have a fair amount of smooth muscle in the blood vessel wall of arteries. As we transition to arterioles, the walls get thinner. As we transition to capillary beds, it's only one cell layer thick of the lining, the epithelium, and a thin connective tissue, which means ease of diffusion because it's very thinly walled, the capillaries. And as we get to the veins, we'll talk about how the blood pressure is actually really low. So the veins do not need to be structurally that strong, so they're much more thinly walled than corresponding arteries. So arteries are thick because they have to deal essentially with higher blood pressure. Capillaries are very thin for diffusion, exchange of materials. And then veins are essentially thin. So the blood moving through arteries is how we can detect blood pressure. So it's the force that blood exerts against the wall of the arteries. So as the heart beats, the blood enters into the arteries and actually causes them to stretch a little bit. When the ventricles contract, ventricular systole. When the ventricles relax, ventricular diastole, there's a slight drop in blood pressure, which means the blood vessels then kind of bounce back and recoil, and that helps push the blood along. So this blood pressure, it's the measurement of the force that the blood exerts against the walls of the arteries due to, the contraction of the ventricles or ventricular systole. The blood pressure, BP, pushes blood from the heart through the arteries into the arterioles, all the way through the capillary beds throughout the entire body. So the blood pressure is recorded as two numbers. For example, 120/80. The 120 refers to the systolic blood pressure, the first number here, okay, the 120, for example. That's referring to the pressure due to ventricular contraction or ventricular systole, the highest blood pressure when those ventricles contract. The second number, which is lower, 80 here in our example, is the second number, obviously. It is the diastolic blood pressure. It's the blood pressure when the ventricles are under relaxation or ventricular diastole. So, for example, here 110/70 means the 110 is the systolic blood pressure and the 70 is the diastolic blood pressure.